There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the quiet is louder than any storm. A moment when even the strongest feel their knees buckle under the weight of something unseen, something ancient, fear. But what if I told you that tonight is different, that a divine whisper has echoed through the silence and declared, I am breaking every pattern of fear. Not tomorrow, not someday. Now. And it begins with a woman named Elira, whose life was nothing but a web of shadows, until God tore the veil. The wind clawed at her windows like desperate hands trying to break through. Elira sat curled in the corner of her dim apartment, knees pressed to her chest, eyes wide with that familiar glassy stare, the one that never really saw anything, but always braced for something. She had known fear since childhood. Not the kind of fear that fades with the morning sun, but the kind that grows roots. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of love, fear of failing, fear of not being enough. Her life was a pattern, one dreadful loop that spun her from one heartbreak to another. Different faces, same endings. Different jobs, same failures. Different prayers, same silence. Until that night. The clock struck 3:33 a.m. Elira's body jolted. That hour had always unsettled her. It was the hour when dreams dissolved and demons stirred. But this time, there was something different. Something sacred. The room, once thick with anxiety, grew unnaturally still. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to hesitate, as if time itself was holding its breath. Then it came, a voice. Not loud, not thunderous, but certain. I am breaking every pattern of fear. Elira froze. Her heart thundered. She wasn't dreaming. She wasn't hallucinating. This voice, it didn't come from the outside. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere eternal. Suddenly, the images of her past rose before her eyes. Her father walking out when she was just 5. The cold words of a teacher telling her she'd never be smart enough. The breakup that shattered her soul. The job she lost after giving everything she had. All those moments, all those failures connected. She realized they weren't random. They were patterns. Wounds wrapped in repetition. Fear passed down like cursed heirlooms. Her chest tightened. Was she doomed to live like this forever? Running in circles, calling it growth? The voice spoke again. This time, it struck her like lightning through her bones. You are not your past. You are not your fear. You are mine. Tears erupted from her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. Somewhere deep within, she remembered that voice. It had always been there, whispering through her doubts, buried beneath her trauma, a divine constant in her chaos. But she had silenced it for too long, drowned it out with her self-loathing, her anxiety, her addictions to what hurt her. Suddenly, the room seemed to glow, not with light, but with presence. She wasn't alone, and she hadn't been for a long, long time. She rose from the floor slowly. Her legs trembled, not from fear, but from unfamiliar strength. The air felt thick with power, and she knew something had shifted, not outside, but within her. The roots of her fears, those invisible chains, had begun to crack. The next morning, she stood before her bathroom mirror, staring at the woman who had once flinched at her own reflection. Her eyes looked different, sharper, deeper, like someone who had seen God in the middle of the night and survived to tell the tale. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because when you decide to break patterns, when you choose to stop living on autopilot, resistance will rise. And it did. 3 days later, Elira's landlord knocked on her door with an eviction notice. Unpaid rent. 3 months behind. Her heart thudded. See? You're still failing. Her old fear hissed. But this time, she didn't crumble. She didn't drown. She prayed. And when she did, the voice returned. I am breaking every pattern of fear. Not removing the storm, it said, but giving you the courage to walk through it. So she did something unthinkable. She took out her laptop and opened her unfinished manuscript. A book she had started writing 5 years ago and abandoned out of self-doubt. A book about surviving trauma, about God, about fear. She stared at the cursor blinking on the white screen. Every part of her wanted to close it, to run, to find comfort in old distractions. But instead, she typed the first line. This is the story of a girl who was not afraid to be afraid anymore. The floodgates opened. Words poured out like rain breaking a drought. She didn't stop writing for 8 hours straight. Her soul bled onto the page. She wrote about her pain, her fear, her divine encounter at 3:33 a.m. She wrote like a woman set on fire by truth. But the world doesn't applaud healing right away. That week, her phone stayed silent. No callbacks from interviews. No miracle payments. Just silence. Yet Elira felt alive. Because this time, her peace wasn't built on outcomes. It was built on obedience. Then came the email. A small Christian publishing house had come across her old blog posts. They loved her voice, her rawness, her truth. They wanted her book. They wanted her. And just like that, a door opened. Not one she had forced or manipulated, but one God had prepared in secret. As her story began to reach readers, messages poured in, people thanking her, telling her that her words healed them, that they, too, had heard God whisper in the silence. But more than success, Elira found freedom, because her life no longer moved in circles of fear. It moved in purpose. And here's what she realized. Patterns don't break by accident. They shatter by decision, by surrender, by believing a higher voice over the one that's tormented you for years. God didn't take away her problems. He didn't erase her past, but he rewrote her patterns. He broke the loop, and in doing so, gave her a new rhythm, one of courage, one of clarity, one of calling. Elira now walks with scars on her skin and strength in her spine. She still has fears, but they no longer control her, because now she knows. When God says, I am breaking every pattern of fear, he doesn't mean he'll just rescue you from the fire. He means he'll walk you through it and make you fearless in the process. So if you've been trapped in cycles, if fear has been your familiar companion, if your nights feel like a war zone and your mornings feel hollow, listen. In the silence, God is speaking, and he's saying, I am breaking every pattern of fear. Not someday, now. And your story is just beginning. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent. It slips into our routines. It hides behind polite smiles and successful careers. It nestles into our habits until we believe it's just who we are. But once fear becomes a pattern, it becomes a prison. And the moment God steps in, the walls don't just shake, they crumble. Elira broke through the first wall, but patterns don't die without a fight. And in this chapter, she would come face to face with a part of fear that disguises itself best, comfort. Elira's book release was met with more love than she had ever expected. She remembered the way her hands trembled as she opened the box of freshly printed copies. Her name embossed in silver, her story etched in ink. She cried that night, not just because she had made it, but because she had made it through the paralysis of fear, through the echo of every voice that told her she couldn't, through every sleepless night when her only companion was a ceiling fan and a broken prayer. But success comes with shadows. As her book gained traction, speaking invitations began to pour in. Churches, women's retreats, schools. And at first, she said yes to everything. She wanted to help, to give back, to keep the fire burning. But she didn't see it coming. She didn't see the old pattern sneaking back in, this time, dressed as approval. Elira began to feel it again. That exhaustion, that breathlessness, the urge to please, to perform, to maintain the image of healed and fearless. It crept in quietly while she was smiling on stage and nodding at conferences. She told herself she was doing God's work, but somewhere deep inside, she was feeding the same beast. Fear of letting people down, fear of being forgotten, fear of becoming small again. She was busy, yes, but not whole. Then came the crash. One Sunday morning, Elira stood backstage at a women's event in Chicago. Hundreds of seats were filled with women waiting to hear her speak. But behind the curtain, her hands were numb, her throat dry, her legs shaking like never before. She felt trapped in her own success. And for the first time since 3:33 a.m., that night in her apartment. The voice had been silent. "Where are you now?" she whispered through clenched teeth. "I thought you broke the pattern." Silence. Then something strange happened. A woman, a janitor, walked up to her with gentle eyes and an old worn Bible. She didn't say much. She simply held the Bible open and pointed to Isaiah 43, verse 1. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." And just like that, the voice returned. But this time, it came with clarity. "I broke the pattern, but you repainted it. You left the prison, but started building a new one out of applause." Alira felt like her lungs collapsed. All this time, she had mistaken noise for growth. She had turned purpose into performance, and fear had shape-shifted into productivity. She stepped outside the venue. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but it felt like mercy. She sat on the curb, her dress dragging along the sidewalk, and cried like a child. That night, she canceled the rest of her tour. Not out of shame, but obedience. She returned home, turned off her phone, and entered a season of silence, a sacred hiding. People didn't understand. Some called her ungrateful. Others said she was throwing away her moment. But Alira wasn't interested in moments. She wanted movement, real transformation. And so, God began to show her the truth. Not all success is sanctified. Not all influence is innocent. And not all opportunities are from heaven. He taught her to recognize the voices in her head, especially the ones that wore masks. The voice that said, "Don't stop or you'll lose everything." The voice that whispered, "They'll forget you if you rest." The voice that hissed, "You were never really chosen." Each one traced back to fear. But now, she had a weapon, awareness. Alira spent her mornings in prayer again. Not the rushed, pretty kind, but the raw, messy kind. The God, "I don't know what I'm doing," kind. And that's where he met her again. Not on stage, not on a podcast, but on her knees. He whispered, "I never needed your performance. I just wanted your heart." She smiled through her tears. This was love, not conditional, not transactional, unmovable. That winter, something else changed. Alira began volunteering at a women's shelter. No lights, no cameras, no social media posts. Just women and wounds and wordless comfort. And in that quiet, fear began to die. Not with a bang, but with a breath. She met a woman named Ava, 22, with bruises hidden under makeup and eyes that had seen too much. She wouldn't talk to anyone, but Alira didn't push. She just sat next to her every week, sometimes reading, sometimes saying nothing. One night, Ava handed Alira a folded note before leaving. "Your silence makes me feel safe. You don't ask me to be anything. Thank you." That was the moment it clicked. Fear isn't always about running from something. Sometimes, it's about believing you have to be someone else to be loved. God had not only broken Alira's pattern, he was using her to break others. But healing isn't linear. One night, Alira had a dream. In it, she was in her old apartment again. The same shadows, the same ticking clock. But this time there was no fear. She walked straight into the darkness and found herself, younger, fragile, the version of her that still flinched at every sound. And she hugged her, tight. When she woke up, she knew. Healing also means embracing the parts of you that were once afraid, not just erasing them. You cannot truly break fear's pattern until you love the one who once lived in it. Alira began writing again, but differently. This time, she didn't write to be heard. She wrote to serve. Her second book wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud, but it was true, and it was titled Silent Courage, Loving the Fearful Version of Me. It became a quiet success. Not a bestseller, but it landed in the hands that needed it most. Letters came in from prisons, from trauma survivors, from teenage girls who wanted to die, but chose to stay after reading her words. Alira's life now moved differently, slower, deeper, no longer driven by urgency, but guided by presence. And the voice that once shook her apartment at 3:33 a.m., it never left. Now, it lived in her heartbeat, in her pauses, in her peace. Breaking patterns isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like resting when you were taught to grind. Sometimes it means choosing silence over validation. Sometimes it means noticing when your drive is fear wearing a fancy suit. God doesn't just remove fear. He rewires the entire system. He peels back layers you didn't know existed. He shows you that freedom isn't an escape. It's in returning to yourself. So, if you're still running, if fear is showing up in your work, your relationships, your silence, your overachieving, pause and listen, because God is still speaking, and He's still saying, I am breaking every pattern of fear, even the ones you've made your identity, even the ones that feel familiar, even this one. You don't have to earn your healing. You only have to receive it. Some storms don't come to destroy you. They come to expose what's been hiding beneath the surface. The fear we ignore often becomes a fear that controls us. Elira thought she had conquered it all, but the next wave of testing would prove that God wasn't just breaking patterns for her. He was breaking them through her. What happens when fear doesn't come from within, but from the people closest to you? It had been 2 years since Elira stepped off the stage and into her season of silence. Her new book, Silent Courage, had quietly made its way into hands that needed healing more than hype. Her days were filled with shelter visits, handwritten notes, deep prayers, and long walks under open skies. Peace wasn't performance anymore. It was a practice. But peace is always tested. It came on a Thursday evening. A knock at the door. Unexpected. When Elira opened it, she froze. It was her father, gray-haired, gaunt, eyes tired, yet still piercing. They hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. He had been the architect of many of her childhood wounds, emotionally distant, harsh with words, always demanding more, but giving little warmth in return. And when Elira first began healing, he never reached out. He dismissed her story as exaggerated, her voice as rebellious, and her God as fantasy. Yet here he stood, a bag in one hand, a tremble in the other. I didn't know where else to go, he whispered. Her first instinct was to close the door, to protect the peace she had finally carved out. But the voice, gentle and steady, rose inside her again. This is not just about you. I'm not only breaking your fear, I'm breaking generations of it. Elira stepped aside. Her father entered quietly, glancing at the worn wooden cross above her kitchen doorframe. I'm not here to fight, he said. I just need to rest somewhere for a few nights. She nodded slowly, but rest wouldn't come easy. That night, old memories visited her in the dark. The slammed doors, the silent treatments, the way she used to tiptoe around the house, shrinking her voice to survive. She stared at the ceiling. Was this a test? A trap? The voice returned. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means refusing to let fear chain you to it. She breathed deeply. The next morning, her father sat at the table, sipping tea awkwardly. His eyes didn't meet hers. They barely spoke. But by the third day, something changed. He asked about her book, then about the shelter, then, stuttering, about God. She didn't preach. She didn't push. She just told her story again, softer this time, not from a stage, not in a sermon, just from one soul to another. He listened, and for the first time in her life, he didn't interrupt. That night, he broke down. He confessed how fear had ruined his marriage, how he was raised by a father even harsher than he had been, how he never learned how to be tender, only tough, how he envied her strength but didn't know how to support it. I was scared of your voice, he whispered, because I never found mine. Elira wept. She realized that fear isn't just personal. It's generational. It travels through DNA like silence in a haunted house, until someone stands up and says, it ends here. And she had said it, loudly, gently, relentlessly. Her father stayed 2 more weeks. He came to the shelter once, just to sit, watched her read stories to broken women, who saw her as hope in human form. He started reading her Bible, tracing the edges of verses she once whispered in her room, terrified he'd hear her. And then one morning, he asked to pray with her. He stumbled through the words. But heaven heard everyone. The morning he left, He hugged her. Not a stiff pat. Not a brief gesture. A real hug. "I'm proud of you," he said, choking on the sentence. She didn't need the words. But still they were a gift. After he left, Alira stood at the mirror, studying her reflection, not just for beauty, but for evidence. Evidence that patterns can be broken, that chains can rust, that even the most frozen hearts can thaw when touched by light. But just as one door closed in peace, another creaked open in warning. Later that week, Alira received an email from a publisher she had long admired. They offered her a deal, not just for a book, but for a podcast, a YouTube series, and a national tour. Millions of eyes, global reach. It was everything she once thought she wanted. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Excitement buzzed, but so did an old, familiar whisper. "If you don't take this now, you'll disappear." That's when she knew fear had returned. But this time it wasn't roaring. It was seductive, wrapped in ambition, whispering that obedience meant obscurity, that faithfulness meant fading away. She closed her laptop and lit a candle. She needed to go back, to where the voice first spoke. That night, she returned to her old apartment. It had been rented out to another tenant. But she stood outside on the sidewalk, staring up at the window that once held her hostage, and she whispered aloud, "Thank you for what you gave me, but I don't live here anymore." She walked away, not fast, not afraid, free. In the weeks that followed, Alira turned down the deal. Instead, she focused on new vision, a safe space for women who have been silenced by fear. Not a brand, not a platform, a haven. She named it Room 333, a place where women could walk in shaking and walk out seen. The name puzzled many. But those who came to know her story, those who read her books, who heard her weep during prayer nights, understood. Room 333 wasn't just a name. It was a moment, a declaration, a breaking point, a place where patterns died and purpose was born. Soon, stories started pouring in. A woman left an abusive marriage after visiting Room 333. Another finally spoke after 10 years of trauma. One teenage girl who had attempted suicide began leading poetry sessions every Friday night. The walls of that little house held more courage than most cathedrals. And Alira? She was no longer the girl who needed fear to stay hidden. She was now the breaker, the first to rise, the one who turned her panic into prayer, her shaking into sermons, her silence into strategy. She realized something deeper. God doesn't just break patterns for your peace. He breaks them for your legacy. Because every chain you shatter, every lie you unlearn, every fear you confront, it becomes a door for someone else. Fear is patient. It reinvents itself, hides in success, whispers through compliments, smiles in ambition. But when God breaks a pattern, He doesn't do it halfway. He keeps breaking it, again and again, until nothing familiar remains but faith. Alira's story wasn't about becoming fearless. It was about becoming free. She didn't slay the dragon once. She faced it every time it changed form. And every time, she came back with more than victory. She came back with vision. If you feel fear's grip tightening, if your silence is starting to feel like a cage, if success tastes more like survival, listen, because the voice that called Alira out of her shadows is still calling you, and he's still saying, I am breaking every pattern of fear, not just so you can breathe, but so the world can hear your true voice echo through the silence. Some endings are not really endings. They're transitions into deeper victories. Alira thought her fear had been buried for good, but what if the last pattern to break was the one inside her own heart? The final chapter isn't always about fighting others. Sometimes it's about forgiving the version of yourself that once settled for less. This is a final test, the one that separates healing from wholeness. Room 333 had become more than a project. It was a living testimony. Women came in with trembling hands and left with eyes that glowed with new light. The kind of light only seen after darkness has overstayed its welcome. Every week, Alira led journaling nights. She read scripture like a love letter and hosted quiet mornings of reflection. The world outside was noisy, but inside, peace echoed like a sacred hymn. But peace once again was tested. It started subtly. During a Thursday session, a woman named Mina raised her hand. She was in her late 20s, raw voiced and fragile-eyed. "How do I forgive myself?" she asked. "For letting fear take over my life? For all the things I never said?" The room went quiet. Alira's chest tightened. Her hands began to sweat, because she realized in that moment she didn't have an answer, not a real one. She had forgiven others, broken patterns from her past, rescued women from silence. But she hadn't forgiven herself for staying silent for so long, for believing the lie that she needed to be small, for every time she chose comfort over calling, for every yes that should have been a no. That night, Alira sat alone in room 333 long after everyone had gone. The walls, once warm with conversation, now felt like mirrors. She walked to the center of the room, took a deep breath, and whispered, "God, I don't know how to love that version of me." The silence answered her, and then, slowly, so gently it made her tremble, the voice returned. "But I loved her. Even then." The tears came fast, not just of sorrow, but of release, because here was a final fear. The belief that who she had been was too broken to be cherished, that her younger self, trembling, voiceless, and lost, wasn't worthy of grace. But grace doesn't come for the perfect. It comes for the willing. And the broken version of Alira had been willing to listen, willing to change, willing to walk forward even when every step shook. That night, she opened an old journal, the one she'd hidden away. Page after page of fear-soaked prayers, scribbled doubts, pleas for escape, half-written verses. She cried as she read the words, not because they hurt, but because she saw how far she'd come, and she whispered to those old pages, to that frightened version of herself, "Thank you. You carried me here." The next morning, Alira began a new practice at room 333. Every woman who walked in was given a blank letter, and she'd say, "Write a note to the version of yourself that survived." Some wrote with anger, some with sorrow, most with trembling love. But something happened through those letters. Chains snapped silently, because when you can look your old fear in the eye and say, "I love you anyway," fear loses its grip for good. But even as this new wave of healing began, a storm was brewing outside those sacred walls. Room 333 had gained media attention. Bloggers wrote glowing reviews. Survivors shared their stories online. Donations poured in. Influencers wanted interviews. And with all that visibility came pressure. Investors called. They wanted to franchise the model. "Imagine 333 in every city," they said. "You're sitting on a gold mine." But Alira's heart tightened, because the moment healing becomes a product, the sacred becomes diluted. She remembered the voice that had whispered to her all those years ago, not in applause, not in fame, but in quiet obedience. So she prayed, and again the voice answered, "Protect what is holy." Alira declined the deals, not out of fear, but out of faithfulness, because breaking the pattern of fear doesn't always look like roaring triumph. It sometimes looks like sacred restraint, choosing purpose over popularity, wholeness over attention. One night, long after everyone had gone, Alira sat at the altar she'd built in the corner of room 333. A single candle burned. She opened her Bible to Isaiah 43, verse 19. "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it?" Her tears came again. But this time, they were tears of completion, because she realized the last chain had snapped. She had forgiven others. She had forgiven herself. And now, she trusted God completely with what came next. The final test wasn't defeating fear. It was trusting joy, trusting that God didn't bring her out of the storm just to survive, but to dance in the rain. Alira's story ends where most stories begin, in quiet courage. She wasn't perfect. She still had days of doubt. But the difference now? Fear didn't lead. Faith did. Every time a woman walked to the doors of room 333, she was greeted not with perfection, but with presence, not with performance, but with peace. Because Alira had learned the deepest truth of all. God doesn't just break patterns of fear for you. He breaks them so you can break them for others. So when you find yourself staring down the same fear again, when the whisper says you'll never be enough, when your past creeps into your future, remember Alira. Remember the trembling girl who became a tower of strength. Remember that your silence is not your identity. Your scars are not your shame. Your past is not your prison. It's your platform. And through it all, the voice still speaks. I am breaking every pattern of fear. Not once, not briefly, but completely. So rise, write your letter, break your pattern, and walk boldly into the room where fear no longer rules. Because that room is you, and God is already inside, waiting to set you free.